Hi. Okay. Thank you for joining us. I think we are good to get started.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll just take a moment to introduce the session, and then I'll hand it over to both of you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining the second session of the Research Annual Summit. We are excited to have you here with us. So this session is actually going to be a bit different from the usual lineup that you would see at a conference. This is actually a live episode of the Real World Wednesday podcast. So for those of you who are not familiar, Real World Wednesdays is one of the longest running podcasts in the real world evidence space. I think they have about 100 plus episodes to their name. And the podcast is hosted by Aaron Kamauu and Matt Veatch, who are leading experts in the field. Aaron is a physician, entrepreneur, and he's a leading industry advisor in the space. He has experience across the spectrum of pharmaceutical, biotech, entrepreneurship, and large CRO businesses. Matt is the co-founder and CEO at Navidence, and he also serves as a consultant in the real-world evidence and data space with over 25 years of experience in life sciences R&D. So with that podcast, Aaron and Matt explore basically all things real-world data and evidence. With a specific focus on its applications in the field of clinical research, drug development, and also clinical decision making. Right, so we are super thrilled and excited to be partnering with them to host this special video podcast session. They generally don't do video sessions, but they were kind enough to accommodate us this time. So we are super excited, and with their guest CK Wang. And I think I just want to take a moment to say that the podcast in general has been inspiration for us in shaping the summit. And Aaron and Matt have been generous in even helping us put together specific parts of the summit. So a big thank you to both of them. And with that, Aaron and Matt, I'll hand it over to you to take it from here.
Well, thanks, Shrisha. Really a pleasure to have our first video Real World Wednesday. This is episode 147. It's been an amazing journey. We've just really enjoyed engaging the RWD, RWE community and learning about people's backgrounds and their journey. And so often working with people, sometimes for years, that you really never know how they came into that role or position, and being able to pull back the curtain a little bit on that is a key focus of Real World Wednesday. And very excited to host CK Wang, who's the Chief Medical Officer for CODA. We'll dive into his proper introduction here in just a minute. We do have a couple of housekeeping things, as we have to highlight at the outset of every Real World Wednesday, that our guest views are their own, not those of any company, agency, or other organization. And we always like to make sure that that's very clear, that the statements made by our guests are personal opinions expressed during this live video discussion, and eventually a podcast that will be found at rwd-rwe.club. And before we turn to CK, Aaron, I turn to you for additional opening comments.
Yes, no, welcome everyone, or I guess welcoming ourselves here. We're happy to collaborate on this with the RWEsearch Summit. And so thank you for having us. As Matt mentioned, our inaugural video, Real World Wednesdays. So people actually see us talking today. Usually I'm pacing in my office talking on audio only in shorts and a t-shirt. So I dressed up today for this. So we're excited to be here. But we really appreciate that, and thank you so much for your introduction as well. We've been doing this since March of 2021. It started off very ad hoc. It's just kind of a forum we thought would be a place where we could kind of connect with colleagues and friends in the field and just keep each other up to date on things that are happening in Real World Data and Real World Evidence. CK, while it is his first time officially as a guest on Real World Wednesdays, he's a longtime participant, and we've heard his voice throughout the last couple of years as well. So looking forward to diving in with you, CK, today as well. But again, thank you, everyone. We posted our website in the chat and highlighted here. If you would like to join our community and join in on future live discussions as well as the podcast recordings, please feel free to do so. We appreciate all of that. And also feel free to share ideas with us of topics that you'd like us to cover. We really appreciate that as well. But without further ado, Matt, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So CK, again, welcome. I noted that you're the Chief Medical Officer at CODA. Today we'll have a discussion around the RWD trifecta of data quality, fit for use or fit for purpose, and AI, leveraging quality real-world data to develop and validate AI for current RWE use cases, given some examples and experiences. But of course, before we do that, we definitely want to hear about your personal journey. We'll take a few minutes. We always highlight this is not just the perfunctory business intro of 90 seconds. This is a little bit more of take us through who you really are, some of the decision gates that you were faced with in your career, and sort of how you got to be where you are today.
Yeah, no. First of all, Aaron and Matt, thanks for having me. As you highlighted, I've been a participant on your podcast, Real World Wednesdays, for gosh, I think probably a couple of years now, and it's been great to hear from all sorts of different individuals in this space. It's been great, and hi to everyone. I think we have people joining all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Yeah, so so as you highlighted, I'm currently the Chief Medical Officer at CODA. We are a real-world oncology data company, and I came to this role in a very roundabout way. And I would say that even if you ask myself 10, 15 years ago, if I would have ever imagined to be in such a role, I would say no, not at all. I started my career in clinical oncology. So I am a medical oncologist by training, and I practiced oncology for about 12 years. And during my time in practice, I had a very specific and probably special focus because I think it is a skill set that more and more, at least here in the States, it's become an extremely rare skill set, is the fact that I was able to learn the business of cancer care. And I was able to help develop and start oncology practices, cancer programs for different hospitals. And so it allowed me to understand the complexities and the issues that not only practices are facing, but also healthcare systems. I transitioned to throughout many different practices during my career, and my last practice was very unique because I had the opportunity of starting a cancer program and the oncology arm for a GU practice. So it was a practice of 55 urologists at the time wanting to develop their cancer program. This practice also owned 2 hospitals with a multi-specialty group. So we became a large multi-specialty practice. The practice ultimately sold to Optum Healthcare. So I was part of Optum for about a couple of years. And during that time, it was a time that I would say was the beginning of the explosion of oncology data. And oncology practice at the same time was getting more complex, yet was getting a lot more regimented, because here in the United States, there are, trying to contain the cost of care. Insurance companies were coming in, implementing, care pathways. And I felt that that my skill set and what I trained to be as a clinical oncologist, a lot of that was being slowly, taken away. But looking at this larger scale of the explosion of oncology data and the complexity of oncology care, my position back then, and this was about almost 8 years ago, was the fact that oncology care, the way it was not sustainable, especially in a community practice setting where many oncologists see a little bit of everything. It was during that same time that IBM Watson Health came knocking on my doorsteps, and it was very interesting because I had completely forgotten about Watson and I guess it was the episode of Jeopardy where Watson beat one of their top contestants, right? And so I ignored the numerous emails multiple times, thinking, man, they must have made a mistake. I'm a physician. I have no computer science training. In fact, I mess up my EHR system all the time, always on the phone with IT folks. So they must not know who I am. But ultimately, I relented and spoke, jumped on a call with my then manager. And the discussion was, a lot of it was what I would tell folks of never to say in a job interview, right? I basically, highlighted what I'm not, just to make sure that she understood what she was getting, right? And at the end of the discussion, she's like, no, I totally get it. And that's exactly why we want you. We want a clinician. We want an oncologist who understands the practice of medicine. Because at that time, for all the folks on this meeting meeting site, is the fact that Watson Health at that time, their goal was to leverage AI to help with clinical decision making in cancer care. And I will say though that there are a lot of historical nature to Watson Health, but the one thing they got right was the fact that they understood that in order to leverage and implement technology in a clinical space, they probably need clinicians speaking to clinicians. So after a lot of, soul searching, I left full-time clinical practice and joined IBM. And that was about 8 years ago. I was there for 2 years. I was one of the earlier oncologists that was at Watson Health. So filled a lot of different roles, from client support, supporting our sales team, to working with our technology team, to trying to help refine the AI algorithms, behind Watson, working with our clinical training partner, you name it. I did a little bit of it. And looking back, it was a little crazy that I was giving talks about AI across the globe in medical meetings. And so did that for 2 years, but toward the end of my 2 years, realized the basic tenet that for AI to work well, right, it needs good data. And I really didn't understand much about data and how healthcare data comes about. And the opportunity at Coda opened up at that time. And I happened to know the chief medical officer, the then chief medical officer, who was also at IBM previously, and came into Coda as the senior medical director, and within a year became the chief medical officer, and been here at Coda since then. And in my day-to-day, I essentially oversee the conceptualization and development of our real-world data assets. Also help the company start up our own research services team, a relatively new team, and today still help out with a little bit of everything, from sales to data quality management to research project alignment. So that's a little bit of me.
That's awesome, CK, and thank you for walking us through that. I've certainly heard bits and pieces of that, so it was kind of nice to hear the flow together. I'm going to draw a couple of parallels that I ran into similarly. I think when I left my clinical path, it was earlier. I was in residency at the time, but still a lot of soul searching, because I think when you make that step, I recognized enough that leaving the clinical path, going back would be really hard. That was a pretty almost permanent step, right? Especially as early as I was leaving. So I can appreciate the soul searching component of it. And I'll say in my case, I don't regret it at all. But it was a big move. The second thing is I did the same thing in my first interview on pharma side. So I was interviewed by Roche out of the blue. I was working at an EHR company at the time. I thought I was starting a career in the EHR world as a medical informaticist, et cetera. And so, yeah, for the first interview I had with the senior VP, most of the interview was me telling them all the things I don't know about pharma. I don't know what the phase 2 or phase 3 trial is. I don't know what. And their answer was, good. Like, we want you to learn it fresh. We don't want you to come in with a priori understandings and expectations, et cetera. So it backfired on me as well. But it worked out. So I appreciate that. I do want to ask a little bit, because those transitions, some of them are a bit dramatic, going from clinical care to technology and then into more leadership role as you kind of have evolved through your kind of post-clinical career. What are some of the kind of lessons you've learned going through those transitions? Maybe a few things that jump out that you're like, wow, I didn't anticipate that before, but now I look back at it and realize these were things that I learned heavily doing just those transitions.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I mean, I think that, if I look back at how I transitioned out of medicine, I mean, I would say that I really didn't understand the world that I was getting myself into. I just understood the world that I was leaving, right? I think that now I will say lucky for me, through my work in developing cancer programs, I've had to communicate, learn to communicate across, multiple different stakeholders, right? Folks that may not even understand, what I'm talking about. And I think that was one thing that I've had to continuously learn and refine throughout my transition, especially in a technology space. I mean, joining IBM, right? It was quite fascinating that, all of a sudden I was talking to computer engineers that actually knew quite a bit about oncology, right? Because that's what they were working on, the space they were working on. But at the same time, they were not clinicians. So at the same time, both impressed and very open. And I think that's one thing is during these transitions, I think one must be very open to ideas from others that you may not have been previously been exposed to, right? For me to listen to suggestions from a computer scientist, I would say in my clinical career I would have thought that was just absolutely crazy, right? And also learning to communicate at their level. And I think those of us who come from a clinical background tend to think that, a lot of what we say to an outsider sound like jargon, just pure jargon, right? I mean, it just may not even make sense at all with all the terminology. Well, the same thing applies to, I think, almost all specialties out there. And also just the way that folks express themselves. And those are lessons that I've had to learn, and also not just not take offense to to comments that were not meant to be maligned, right? I think a lot of folks in the industry that are working to solve medical problems acknowledge that there are issues in our healthcare delivery, right? Not just in the United States, but globally. But I can imagine that, there are some clinicians that might not take too well to that type of criticism, right? That's a space that they grew up in. That's a space that they worked in, right? That was their livelihood. And all of a sudden, someone who's never seen a patient is criticizing the whole system, right? But there are valuable insights to be gleaned from the outside, right? And I think that those are very important lessons that I've learned, and those are the same lessons that or those type of learnings from those lessons, are the same that I still, deal with today. And those are the same learnings that I try to impart onto my more junior team members. And because a lot of what I feel passionate about is, not just the space I'm in, but I think I've seen a lot, done a lot, that I think I have a lot of knowledge to pass on. And I think I'm at that phase in my career and in my life where I think imparting that type of knowledge to others is actually very important to me.
I love that. CK, this is great to hear not only your personal journey, but just some of the decision gates and how that's influenced you and developed your career. And something that strikes me, a chief medical officer role is really the chief clinician, the chief scientist in many ways of the organization. And you've got the perfect blend of background of the clinician, the data science, all of those things. How important is it for the CMO to be actively involved in actually setting strategy and the direction of the organization?
Matt, I will say that I think that is, in my opinion, that is a multi-billion-dollar question, right? I think that if you're a company in a space that touches patients or touches clinicians, you need clinical leadership, right? We've seen throughout history, and even today, large companies who throw billions and billions of dollars into a sector that they are new to, especially the healthcare sector, and thinking money can solve all problems. But if you look at it, many of those companies have failed and continue to fail, right? And I truly believe that foundationally, the reason why is because they may have is that, despite having a great idea, maybe great, technology, is the fact that they didn't have that clinical guidance to hone in on the right strategy. So they just missed the mark. And in this space, I've always said this, is that in this clinical space, you don't get many chances to make mistakes, right? Because important things are at stake here. We're not making a decision on what type of coffee you may like, right? Or what flight should you get on? We were talking about, patients' lives, right? And depending on the sector you work in, if your customer is pharma, right, there's billions of dollars of pipeline dependent on those decisions, right? And so these aren't small decisions, and I do feel very strongly that all companies in this space really need strong clinical guidance.
Yeah, no, that's great. And what a great segue. We should actually dive into the topic a bit here, because I think it's very relevant to exactly what you just brought up. First, though, I'd like to invite the audience to please ask questions. We'll try to monitor the comments between Matt and I. We'll try to monitor the comments, and you can throw questions in there. I don't know that there's an easy way to have you join us on stage. So at least add your comments or questions into the chat, and then we'll try to catch those, and we can kind of answer those together with CK as we go. So we, similar to the welcome session this morning, we want this session to also be very interactive. So we welcome you to ask questions in the chat. And then CK, so on that note, right, this is a highly sensitive field. We're talking about healthcare. And we have some real big advances in AI. Let's talk about the trifecta. We got data quality, we got fit for use, we got AI, right? And there, I think, are some really exciting advancements that people are seeing broadly outside of healthcare, whatever, but then also a lot of ideas around how interesting this could be in healthcare. I can't help but have heard many people refer to things like the Star Trek examples where, robotics and AI systems are diagnosing patients left and right. Okay, maybe there's a future, right? But let's get into a little bit around data quality part of it, because I know that's something that you brought up to me before around how important that is going to play a role in the development and use of AI over time in healthcare. And secondly, I want to kind of tie in what you just brought up around the importance of having clinical expertise to drive things like what is quality of data and how can that be used here. So I'll let you kind of have the stage to set a foundation here for this.
Yeah, so I think that maybe we should start by tackling AI. It's a huge topic, but I'm going to try to boil it down to 30 seconds here, right? I think the audience here know that AI has been around for a long time, right? Dating back to the 1950s. And I think that, what we have seen though in the last, I would say, in the public realm, at least, I was in the last 5 to 10 years, this explosion of AI capability. What we've seen though is novel, in my opinion, in this space, right? Not much happened for multiple decades, but I think what happened was the invention of amazing computer chips, right? This whole I think advancement, tremendous advancement in this large language model neural networks that happened, but also critical to that was data access, right? Data is foundational to AI, no matter what space you're talking about, right? Whether it is in the in the public domain, your Google search now, Gemini, right? GPT, it's all trained on data. Without data, it doesn't work. Now, interestingly though, and maybe we'll circle back, to healthcare really quickly, is that there was an article that was published in Nature recently talking about data and training and the future of AI models based on the data that it's trained on, right? I would say the first generation of AI was trained on mostly data that was created by humans. I mean, that is what it's supposed to do, right? Reflect the human experience in an unbiased way, ideally. However, foreseeably, right, one can imagine that as AI models are generating their own data, next generation of AI models can actually train on previous AI models or data that may or may not be correct or may not reflect the human reality, right? And the authors of this paper call it model collapse. And this speaks to the foundation of the type of data being used to train future AI models, right? Now, I think if we just, kind of focus on healthcare, I would say the data being used to train AI models in healthcare is and should be very different than the general AI models out there for general public consumption, right? Largely, the data that's being trained in the healthcare space, especially when it comes to clinical, in the clinical realm. Let's talk about the clinical realm. We're not talking about, revenue cycle management for hospitals and staffing algorithms and all that stuff, right? We're talking about, things that touch patients one way or another, or touch clinicians. These models are trained on healthcare data that is not largely public, mostly private and well-curated data sets that were developed specifically for that specific purpose, right? And I think that if we take a step back and look at, I think there's a terminology we've used quite a bit in RWD, RWE, right? Is that these data sets are fit for use or they're fit for purpose. And those data sets need to be obviously need to reflect the goal or the use case of the AI model, but also it has to be representative enough and of high enough quality, right, to represent what we're seeing in the real world. And then, we need to also differentiate the difference between, I think, a training data set and a validation data set, right? All algorithms need to be validated and need to be assessed, right? I think the FDA and many different bodies have stipulated that as well, right? And so I think this kind of brings, I think, the whole concept of RWD and RWE, I think, and AI back in a very kind of, full circle, in the sense that in the medical space, right, in order for us to trust AI, we need to understand the data that it was trained on, ensure that that data is high quality and fit for use, right? And that it has been validated on a representative data set to ensure that it is truly functioning the way it's supposed to be, right? And then there's a lot of implications downstream. I think, if you are the user or adopter of that technology, what you need to think about. But I think, I think we won't talk about that. That should be another, probably a different podcast for a different focus, with a different focus. But, I think that fundamentally in all this, right, back to our earlier comments, is the fact that I do think that clinical guidance is needed every step of the way. Similar to, how we develop data, I think clinical guidance needs to be there. When we develop this technology, we need clinical guidance as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And thanks for setting that foundation. I think it makes a lot of sense. To one of your more recent comments around, along that path around the use of the data to help develop these systems, and then we need to validate the algorithms, the AI systems themselves, that they really are performing the way they're intended to. I can't help but really kind of highlight what you were saying around the importance of the underlying data itself. And that data itself also has to be valid for the use of what it needs, what we're using it for. Meaning, and I think for those of you who were here in an earlier session, Dan Hausman made a comment on the panel with you, Matt, where he said, look, in some cases, working with one health system or one data source can be very helpful. It can be very detailed, it can be very insightful. In other cases, you have to have a breadth of coverage of data to know that whatever you're developing and whatever insights you're gaining can be extrapolated. And I think with AI, that's going to be really important. We might find great data sets to help develop an algorithm or validate an algorithm, and yet can that really be extrapolated across health systems, across regions of the world, et cetera? What nuances do we need to really account for there? And I couldn't help but think through those as you were talking.
No, absolutely. And I think that that is a perfect example, right, of what I was highlighting earlier. And, and to your point, I think a lot of these AI tools in the clinical and medical space have been developed in an academic center, right? Trained on the single institution or maybe a handful of academic institution data. However, how do we know that, academic, site patients are similar to the community practice where 80% of Americans seek their cancer care, right? And, if this algorithm or this tool is developed in the Northeast, right, in a large urban area, how do we know it actually is representative and can work on patients down in Florida, in Texas, in Colorado, where Matt is, or out in Utah, where you are, right, Aaron? So I think that these are foundational concepts that I think developers, right, need to keep in mind as they develop technology such as this.
I love this. This is exciting, and CK, just drawing from your wealth of experience and living these things every day. I'm curious to get your thought on, in terms of validating data, the impact of more focus on globalization. There's the regional consideration when we talk about real world data and the elements that would be part of the evaluation, and that is the validation criteria. But how can we think about that, or what's important to think about as we look at more globalization of use cases and access to global data?
Yeah, Matt, that is a great question. I'm gonna for disclaimer, as disclaimer for every audience member here, CODA, we work in the United States with U.S. data. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring in my learnings from IBM here. So when I was with IBM, the majority of our customers actually at that time, and where I traveled to majority, was in India, the Middle East, and East Asia, and China, Korea, and Taiwan specifically. And that was the very first time that I was exposed to the international oncology community. Was the first time I was able to understand and witness care delivery on the ground, and really start thinking about the similarities and differences, right, between different geographies with regards to cancer care. And like any naive clinicians from the United States, right, where I think globally, we talk about the NCCN guidelines, we think about the American Society of Clinical Oncology, that those organizations tend to be standard bearers, so to speak, across the world. However, those standards, right, need to be, I think, have to be modified to meet local needs, right? In countries where most patients cannot afford such expensive drugs, for example, right? Or where drugs aren't even approved, at all, where we have access to here in the States. Those are things that we, we need to think about. But I will say, though, what really struck me back then was the fact that despite the local, regional, socioeconomic, political challenges that may exist, is the fact that the underlying scientific principle and how we think about patient care is the same. And so as a result, I found that I had a lot more in common than an oncologist. Compared to with an oncologist that is in India, in China, than I thought, right? Because we both read the same literature, we understand what is out there in the scientific space. However, our day-to-day can be vastly different. In order for these tools to be helpful, right, across the different regions, is the fact that I do believe that they need to take into consideration the norms and the standards, and challenges that exist, in that geography, so that they could be the most useful, to a patient and to a clinician, in a different part of the country. Now, I will say though, also, I think what's very important is the fact that we also know that people with different racial, ethnic backgrounds can respond very differently to different drugs, right? And this has become an increasing focus in oncology over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think that understanding that, right, acknowledging that and working that into consideration, for any AI tools that's meant to be used in different geographies is critical. But then I will say though, on the flip side is getting data out of different areas can be very difficult. And we tend to think that getting real world data, getting data out of the EHR here in the United States is difficult. Well, 80-90% of US practices use EHR. It's been around for 14 years, right? And I would say that the standardization by which oncologists document in the United States is pretty rigid nowadays. You go to a country where EHRs are just currently being, adopted, right? Where there's no standards in documentation. Things get a lot more complex and a lot more difficult. And I don't have a solution to this problem, but it is a real problem. It's a problem that I've come across as we vet international data sets, trying to understand what is out there, right? But I do, and for all the folks on this call, this is a call to action, right? If you're a clinician, if you deal with clinicians, I think in order for us to move this real world data space forward in any medical specialties, we need to generate good data to begin with.
I love the call to action. So let's reiterate that as we go. I look at the international landscape of, let's call it real world data, but really it's just healthcare data, right? And there are many ways in which data is collected that represents a person's well-being, health status, kind of care they give themselves or receive from others. It's a broad kind of perspective. And, to your point, there's a ton of variability. Maybe given the kind of adoption of EHR systems and healthcare IT systems in the US, we're like top middle tier of that. But, some countries have like really well-established national systems, like in the Scandinavian countries that are kind of like aspire towards. I think Singapore's national EHR system is really strong. Taiwan has a great, system there that I've heard of and seen a little. And then you have others where it's like they're barely even implemented at all. And I think to your point, the variability of just systems across the board already creates a challenge to have a single solution for sure there. I want to use this though to guide towards a couple of questions in the comments and in the chat. Sure. Thank you for those who are adding them in there. Dr. Mira and Chetna Gohel, thank you so much for your couple of questions. I'm going to kind of merge them together. They're questions that are they're directly about data quality to use data for AI development, which is, I know exactly kind of something that you have been diving into lately. And one question was a bit around the kind of metrics that help us have effective confidence in the data is quality. Like, are there specific metrics that you might look at to help evaluate data as being of quality for that use? And the other one is, or on the flip side, the different question of, is there an example where it was poor data that resulted in an AI outcome, if you will, that was bad, let's say, or was not what we were looking for. So I don't know if you have an example of the bad example, but the other side is the good example of like, what do you look for when you're kind of evaluating data as appropriate for use for AI development?
Yeah, and and so you're correct. I'm gonna have to think about this bad scenario. I can't think of one right now, to be clear and transparent. But in terms of data quality, right? And this does not have to be just for AI development. I mean, this is for any use case, right? I think as we talk about real world data and the development of a quality data set, I think the concept of, I think people tend to focus on, the completeness of data elements to be like a very important, I think, measure of data quality. But I would say that quality, when it comes to data, exists, and the injection of quality should exist at multiple different junctures of a data set development. I think, and first and foremost, I think the very first step is where the data is coming from, right? I think, Aaron, you highlighted there's so many different sources of real world data out there, right? From sensors to wearables to patient reported outcomes to claims data to EHR data. Is that, looking at your specific use case, you need to hone in on those specific data set that comes from a source that suits your needs, right? I think, let's do very specific examples. In medicine today, a lot of AI tools lie within cardiovascular disease, radiology, and pathology, right? The needs of each use case is very different, right? For a pathology, right, tool, you need access to high quality pathology slides, as well as probably the basic clinical information surrounding that patient, right? Radiology, you don't care about pathology slides, you care about the radiology images, but you need the right images, right? So understanding kind of where that data is coming from is critical. When it comes to clinical data, right, is it a academic or tertiary care center versus the community or traditional kind of, oncology delivery center is important. And then also understanding, the source of the data and kind of the thinking behind the data and how it was developed, right? We like to say, at my company, and I think we touched on this earlier, is the fact that, data is data, but it's the context behind like data that matters, right? Because data can be, in my opinion, you could take any data set and it could be misinterpreted, misused, and before you know it, a completely unintentional use case, was applied, and a crazy, conclusion was developed out of that data set. I mean, you and I both know this, right? We've heard a lot of those research that have been, redacted because of, fraud or whatever, right? This can happen, in product development, in data sets, studies and everything. But, understanding, the specific use case and where it's coming from, the intention of the data and the context surrounding that data, that is critical. And if you don't have that, I don't care how complete a data set is, you probably need to take a step back and look at all those foundations, right? It's about the transparency behind, what that data is and where and what is meant, how it's meant to be used. And then also understanding that, I think we touched upon this many times, is the fact that I don't believe there's a data set out there that's appropriate for any type of use, right? But I think what is great is that some data sets can be customized for specific use cases, right? So understand if what your needs, are, and whether or not it requires customization of a data set out there, and hopefully find a data provider that can do that for you and with you, right? If they can't, you're probably better off not accessing that data at all than to use a data set that was not meant for your use case. Mm-hmm. And so those are the things that I think about, so it's a lot of asking questions, understanding where that data is coming from, understanding the processes, you understand that. How was the data abstraction and curation? How does it happen, right? How are people trained? Because today a lot of real world data is still requires human curation, right? Are they looking at the source document, or are they looking at data that was transmitted, right? And it was transmitted, how do you ensure the completeness of that data that was transmitted, right? And the fidelity of that data. So there's a lot here. And hopefully that offers some considerations.
This is absolutely. I'm really enjoying this, CK, and actually the next question is very, very topical to the points that you were just making, and I'd like to thank Ria for posing this question in the chat. Given the current limitations in data standardization, how can we ensure that AI models trained on heterogeneous RWD data sets maintain high predictive accuracy across different healthcare settings?
Yeah, no, that is a very important question, right? And you're right. There's no current data standards. I know that there are efforts trying to standardize, data across the world, but nonetheless, I think we're still in the very early stages of that. I think that at least in practical, I guess in the practical space is the fact that unfortunately today. We have to source data from many different data sources that now there's some data sets that are more similar to each other than different. I mean, I just need to call them out, right? And I think that this commercially available real world data space is I would say a little bit more mature in the US than in different parts of the world, right? I think Europe has its own challenges. And as you highlight, Aaron, there are countries with really great data sets out there, right? Because of just the nature of their healthcare system, right? And how they share data. But in the US, at least in the ecosystem here, is the fact that I think the well-established entities that provide real-world data, at least in the oncology space that I know of, is that the data model is relatively similar, right? And they are different than each other, but I think overall they're more similar than they're not. On a global level, I can't really speak to that because I can imagine that can be all over the map, right? Especially space, is just developing. I think that we've had about 10 to 15 years head start here in the States when it comes to developing these real world data sets.
Yeah, I think that variability is so key, and therefore it requires thoughtfulness, right? To be aware of that. I'm going to follow this flow, and John, thank you for both your comment and question. I will warn the audience. I know we're kind of coming to closing here, so we may not be able to touch on all. I see a few additional questions in the chat. We may not be able to hit all of those, but we really appreciate the questions and the participation, and so we'll note them if we don't answer them live right now. CK, we can share them with you, and maybe you can have an opportunity to follow up with folks in the chat even directly. But John, thank you. So John has noted one about the NCCN Global Standard Initiative. Rather than read through his whole point, one of the things I'm kind of wondering about is how do you look at CK clinical guidelines that come in both, I guess, US, international standard guidelines, and then that perspective of actual clinical care and how it's documented in data, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you that, and then John will come to your question that I think we'll kind of have a closing remark around. But yeah.
I think just my word. I hope no one on the meeting is from NCCN, and don't get offended if you are. But the NCCN guidelines are very, in my opinion, they're relatively high level. They're non-committal, and clinicians need to use their own judgment when using the NCCN, right? Mm-hmm. And that's probably the use case. That's probably how we should use any tool. Right, in medicine anyways, like you as a clinician need to use your judgment. Even in AI tools, I think we see a question here about, should you correlate AI data that you receive? Absolutely. Yeah. You are the clinician. I've made a point that in that room, there's only one doctor, you, right? That tool is not a doctor. The NCCN guideline is not a doctor. And so those guidelines were meant to be flexible and high level. And if you look at it, most NCCN guideline recommendations don't really have strong evidence. They are just consensus recommendations, just FYI, okay? And so as a result, right, they do expect clinicians to bring their own, I'm going to say, their art right, a medicine, right, and then implementing it onto those guidelines to come up with a tailored treatment plan for your patient. Now, I think what's unfortunate is that through time, at least here in the United States, right, for the purpose and intention of controlling cost of care, is that some payers have stuck to the NCCN guidelines really strictly, and that any deviation requires, right, an explanation of why you are deviating, right, even though that's not how the NCCN guidelines were initially conceived to be used for. And so, but being high level, then you can see that it can be tailored across different regions, right? And that, look, you know, if a certain class of drugs are not available in your country, you just go to the next level of drugs, right? That are listed. And I don't think the NCCN today contain a negative treatment recommendation, meaning you should not do this. It's always these are the possibilities, and good luck in a way. You know, yeah. And so I actually think that, and that's oncology. I think no other space has such regimented, I think, care pathways spelled out, I guess. And then you can see how then it's a very, back to our AI discussion, it's a very ripe space for anyone in the industry, with the technology, working AI, thinking, hey, we have algorithms here already. It should be relatively easy to impose my technology or AI onto an algorithm and build on top of that. And the answer is yes and no, because there's a lot of nuance behind it.
Yeah, I think a follow-up on that. So I think clinical guidelines are that. They're guidelines. For the clinical trial world, we think of the guidances from the regulatory agencies as a similar way. There are guidance, they literally say non-binding in the front part of it, but at the same time, we know there are expectations around that. You have clinical practice, and then you have reflection of clinical practice and documentation. And they don't always connect the dots perfectly, but we need to be aware of that. And so John heard your call of action earlier, and his question was, as a clinician involved in rolling out a new EHR system at my healthcare center, what steps can I take to optimize EHR data?
First of all, I think I'm at fault for this, right? Just make sure that the data that you're inputting is accurate. After I joined Coda, I was still in part-time clinical practice, and I went back, looked at a note for a patient, and in one note, I clearly stated that the patient was white. The next note, the patient was black. I was aghast when I came across that, right? And so I fixed it, right? That's not uncommon, right? And we have a way of just propagating notes forward. What we call it copy forward, right? And so any mistakes that were contained in previous notes will be propagated. Hey, when a patient's disease staging changes, clearly document that, right? Mm-hmm. Many times it's not clearly documented. And so I think, I think all oncologists understand the foundations of data elements that we need to document and that we need to make a clinical decision, but we just don't document it clearly. Aaron, to I think your earlier comment, right? I think now clear documentation can take forever. I'm not saying that you should spell out everything and anything, right? However, back to AI, there are actually AI tools nowadays that are helping clinicians document, where they're listening to the conversations and actually transcribing a note for the clinician. There's been different technologies in the past, but there's using AI tools to actually summarize a note. I'm hoping that type of technology will capture the more relevant data that we need to so that better used, for the research purposes in the back end. And I think when that day comes, I probably will be out of a job, I think, but I think that will be a very welcome day.
Well, I'm not worried about that at all, because there's other mountains to climb, new chapters of your entrepreneurial career. This is fantastic. Well, CK, thank you so much. We must draw to a close, unfortunately. I think we could talk for probably a few more hours. This is a wonderful topic. Really appreciate your expertise. I do want, just as part of the call to action, I know that many of the participants today may be unfamiliar with Real World Wednesday, again, this is the forum where Aaron and I bring in luminaries like CK to talk about these very topics in the RWD, RWE space. And that is every Wednesday, hence the name. And you can find information in LinkedIn. You can follow our profiles, and you'll see that. But CK, again, thank you so much. It was wonderful to get your insights. The other call to action here, I think, is that there are plenty of opportunities for real thought leadership in the use of real world data and the trifecta. And that extends to the Middle East. And I know many participants today are from the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. If these things are of interest to you, again, there's real opportunity for market leadership and thought leadership in this space. And we would love to see more accessible real world data in the MENA region.
Well, thank you for having me, and to all, have a wonderful summit.
Thank you so much. Final closing comments over to Aaron.
Yeah, no, just thank you. Thank you, CK. Great conversation, inaugural video and collaboration with RWEsearch. And so thank you to RWEsearch for hosting us here as part of your summit as well. We really appreciate it. And thank you for all the attendees. And we look forward to seeing and hearing you on the future Real World Wednesdays.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for partnering with us and doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Shrishta. Appreciate your help.
Thank you.